If there's one lesson I've learned living under an HOA, it's this. The people in power, the ones with the clipboards and petty fines, often believe the rules don't apply to them. They thrive on intimidation, on the quiet compliance of neighbors who would rather pay a ridiculous fine than engage in battle. But the problem with giving people like that too much power is that eventually they start believing they're untouchable. That's exactly how this story started. My name's Eric, 47 years old, a retired law enforcement officer who thought he'd finally found peace in a quiet suburban neighborhood. My wife, Jenna, and I bought our home 4 years ago. It wasn't just a house to us. It was a reward for years of hard work, saving and sacrificing. A cozy craftsman tucked into the edge of a so-called private community, surrounded by woods and quiet roads, where we thought we'd finally enjoy life without the stress of my old job following me home. What I didn't realize at the time was that this particular community came with its own flavor of stress, the HOA, or more specifically, Karen. Karen wasn't just the HOA president. She was the HOA. In her mind, every square inch of the neighborhood existed under her personal scrutiny. She lived 3 doors down in the largest, most meticulously landscaped house on the block. If a mailbox leaned an inch too far, Karen noticed. If a lawn was mowed a day late, Karen issued a warning. And if you dared question her authority, she made it her mission to remind you who held the power in this suburban kingdom. At first, Jenna and I stayed under the radar. We paid our dues, kept our yard neat, didn't engage. But the moment Karen noticed I had an RV parked beside my garage, fully within my rights, mind you, according to bylaws, the trouble began. It started with the letters. Passive-aggressive notices disguised as friendly reminders slipped under our door. Complaints about unauthorized storage of large vehicles. Demands to maintain neighborhood standards. I responded politely, attaching copies of the HOA's own rules highlighting that my RV was grandfathered in under previous allowances. Karen didn't care. When her words didn't work, she escalated the threats of fines, hearings, even legal action. The mistake she made was assuming I was like everyone else on the block, someone who would fold, who would pay to avoid the hassle. She didn't know my background, didn't know how many years I'd spent dealing with people exactly like her, hiding behind full authority. I documented everything, every letter, every notice, every absurd threat. I filed it all away, preparing for the inevitable confrontation. But what I wasn't prepared for was how far Karen would go. One Saturday, Jenna and I decided to head out for a weekend trip. Nothing fancy, just a short drive upstate, sometime a hike and disconnect. Before leaving, I did what I always do. I locked the doors, checked the cameras, made sure the house was secure. Habit from my old life. We were barely halfway to our destination when my phone buzzed with an alert from my home security app. Motion detected, front door. Motion detected, living room. My stomach sank. No one had permission to be there. No deliveries scheduled. No workers expected. I pulled up the live feed. There she was, Karen, in my house, keys in hand, clipboard tucked under her arm, striding through my living room like she owned the place. For a moment, I couldn't process it. Who does that? Who just unlocks someone else's home and walks in? But as the shock gave way to anger, I realized exactly what was happening. Karen had decided that HOA authority extended beyond property lines, beyond fences, beyond locked doors. In her mind, my home was hers to inspect, her standards to enforce. What she didn't know was that breaking into the home of a retired cop is a mistake you only make once. I called the police immediately, gave them access to my security feed, and explained who she was and what she was doing. They responded fast. Local officers knew me, respected me. And breaking and entering? That's serious, HOA or not. But I wasn't content to just watch this unfold remotely. We turned the car around, cut our trip short. I wanted to see Karen's face when she realized just how far she'd stepped over the line. By the time we pulled back into the driveway, 2 squad cars were already there, lights flashing, doors open, officers standing in my front yard with Karen in handcuffs. Her smug expression replaced with something far more satisfying. Fear. Neighbors gathered on the sidewalks, whispers spreading like wildfire. Karen, the queen of the HOA, being let out of someone else's house in cuffs? It was better than any suburban soap opera. The officers filled me in. Karen had used a maintenance key, when she wasn't authorized to have any more, claiming she needed to inspect for violations. She'd even brought forms to document her findings. What she didn't realize was that using that key wasn't just trespassing. It was breaking and entering, criminal intent, unlawful access. The police had found her in my kitchen, writing up notes about my interior paint choices. I couldn't help but laugh. Karen froze when she saw me step out of the car, tried to sputter some excuse about misunderstandings and neighborhood welfare, but the officers weren't buying it. Neither was I. I pressed charges on the spot. Breaking and entering, criminal trespass, intent to commit fraud. You name it. And thanks to my security system, I had every moment captured in crystal clear HD. Karen was escorted to the back of the cruiser, her clipboard left behind like the symbol of authority she no longer held. Jenna stood beside me, silent, watching the woman who tormented us for months finally face consequences. But even as Karen disappeared down the street, I knew this wasn't over. Not yet, because people like Karen don't learn from consequences. They dig deeper. They get desperate. And I was ready. Karen's arrest should have been the end of it. Any reasonable person would have taken that as a hard stop, a sign they'd pushed their petty authority too far. But Karen, HOA Karen, she wasn't wired like that. Her entire identity was built around control, and losing that grip, in front of the whole neighborhood no less, only fueled her desperation. The very next day, as Jenna and I sat sipping coffee on the porch, a certified letter arrived. Not from Karen, not directly, but from her lawyer, or rather, from a firm clearly used to dealing with petty civil disputes and HOA nuisance cases. Inside was a formal complaint, laughable really, claiming I had caused undue harm and emotional distress by allowing police to arrest her on what she described as a misunderstood administrative visit. According to her attorney, Karen believed she had implied authority to inspect any home within the HOA's jurisdiction, that her actions were misinterpreted as unlawful entry, that she'd suffered severe humiliation because of my overreaction. I laughed out loud reading it. Jenna wasn't as amused. She's not going to stop, is she? No, I said, but that's fine. I'm just getting started. See, what Karen didn't realize was that her little stun had already triggered a chain reaction she couldn't control. The HOA board, already weary of her antics, was in full-blown panic mode. Her arrest made the local paper, not front-page news, but juicy enough for the community section. HOA president arrested for unlawful entry. I didn't need to say a word. The headline did the work for me. Neighbors who'd once cowered under Karen's scrutiny now openly questioned her authority. Emergency meetings were called. Board members who'd rubber-stamped her behavior before were suddenly eager to distance themselves. Resignations followed. Dues payments dried up. Lawsuits against Karen, both pending and new, began stacking up. Yet Karen pushed forward with her threats against me. Her attorney sent demands. Retractions. Cease and desist letters. They wanted me to apologize. Publicly. To admit wrongdoing. To state for the record that Karen had been within her rights. They even threatened to sue me for defamation. My attorney's response was simple. Bring it. What Karen didn't grasp, what she refused to see even now, was that I wasn't just some neighbor with a grudge. I was a retired cop with years of experience dealing with people who thought authority gave them immunity. I knew the law inside and out. I knew how to document, how to protect myself legally, how to build a case so airtight even the most stubborn HOA Karen couldn't squirm her way through. While her lawyer fired off baseless letters, I gathered my arsenal. Security footage, police reports, witness statements from neighbors who'd seen Karen enter my home uninvited, documentation of her prior harassment, letters, fines, threats, a timeline so detailed it might as well have been Exhibit A in a courtroom drama. And then I played my trump card. I contacted the county prosecutor's office. Quietly, professionally, explained the situation, provided the evidence, detailed Karen's history of harassment. They were more than interested. Because here's the thing, HOA Karen didn't just break into my house. She used stolen keys. She impersonated authority. She violated multiple statutes beyond simple trespassing. Criminal charges were one thing. Federal charges? That was a whole different level of pain. Subpoenas were filed. Karen's lawyer went silent. Behind the scenes, Karen scrambled. She tried to rally the remaining HOA members, all three of them, to defend her, tried to frame herself as a victim of male aggression, spinning tales of how I targeted her unfairly. But the neighborhood wasn't buying anymore. They'd seen the footage. They'd seen the cops cuff her. They knew the truth. It wasn't long before the HOA's legal counsel advised dissolution. The insurance premiums alone, thanks to Karen's actions, had become unsustainable. Without insurance, without funds, without members, the HOA ceased to exist. Officially, legally, the paperwork filed. The bylaws void. The HOA signs came down. Karen lost everything she'd built her miserable little empire on. But she still thought she could win against me. Her next move was predictable. A civil suit. Filed personally this time, not through the HOA. Claims of harassment. Emotional distress. Loss of reputation. I didn't flinch. My attorney smiled. Let her try. Discovery tore her claims apart. My security footage wasn't just good. It was damning. High definition, time-stamped, clear as day. Karen entering my home without consent. Karen rifling through my belongings. Karen writing violations on a clipboard like some suburban dictator on a power trip. Depositions revealed even more. Former board members testified about her obsession with me, about closed-door meetings where she plotted ways to make my life harder, about her glee at the thought of breaking a new guy. Her words, not mine. By the time we reached court, Karen's case was in tatters. The judge barely concealed his contempt. His ruling was swift, brutal, and final. Case dismissed. Counterclaims approved. Damages awarded. Karen owed me, financially, publicly, personally. Her house went up for sale within a month. Quietly, shamefully, without the fanfare she usually craved. She moved out of state, reportedly to live with family. Rumor had it she was considering filing bankruptcy to escape the financial fallout. I didn't care. What mattered was that the neighborhood was free. My home was secure. My life was peaceful again. And Karen? She'd finally learned what happens when you pick a fight with the wrong man. Even after Karen's lawsuit against me collapsed and the HOA had officially dissolved, I knew better than to let my guard down. People like Karen don't just walk away quietly. They retreat. They stew. They look for cracks, for weaknesses, for ways to reclaim the power they think was stolen from them. I knew her type too well to assume she'd learned her lesson. But what Karen didn't understand, what she could never understand, was that she'd already lost the moment she crossed the threshold into my home. Still, I wasn't done. Not because I wanted revenge in a petty sense, but because people like her needed to be made examples of, not just for my peace of mind, but for everyone who'd ever lived under the oppressive thumb of an HOA run by a tyrant like her. I didn't just want Karen out of my life. I wanted to ensure she never had the chance to do this to anyone again. First, I made sure the destruction of the HOA was public, permanent, and impossible for her to spin. I contacted local news outlets. Not tabloids, but respected community reporters who thrived on neighborhood stories with a moral. They loved it. The HOA president who broke into a cop's home. The headlines practically wrote themselves. Articles detailed her arrest, her lawsuits, the collapse of the HOA, and her desperate attempts to paint herself as a victim. Public opinion shifted fast. If she had any social standing left in our town, it evaporated overnight. Neighbors who'd once feared her wrath now openly mocked her downfall. Sidewalk conversations became bolder. Stories of her past petty behaviors surfaced like bloated fish in a drying pond. The woman who fined people for mismatched paint shades now couldn't even walk her dog without hearing whispers behind her back. If she hoped for sympathy, she found none. But that was just the surface-level retaliation. Behind the scenes, I dug deeper. See, Karen had built her petty empire not just on HOA power, but on manipulation, half-truths, and shady practices. I started looking into how she'd gotten her hands on that master maintenance key, A key she wasn't supposed to possess anymore. A key that should have been turned over years ago when the HOA updated its policies. Turns out, Karen had friends in low places. A contractor who'd done work for the HOA. A cousin who worked for the locksmith company they'd used. Small connections she'd leveraged to keep access long after she was supposed to. I gathered statements, quiet interviews, documentation, and I handed it all over. Not to the police this time, but to the state licensing board for contractors and locksmiths. Investigations opened. Fines were issued. Licenses were suspended. Karen's network of enablers started to crumble along with her reputation. And then there was the real estate angle. Karen had always fancied herself a real estate guru, the self-appointed expert on property values, neighborhood standards, and the almighty resale price. She dabbled in small-time property management, renting out homes in nearby communities where she could still lord over tenants with her clipboard and rulebook. I made a few calls, quiet inquiries, found tenants who'd been harassed, fined, threatened over trivial matters. Some hadn't known their rights. Others had been too intimidated to fight back. I helped them, connected them with legal aid, pointed them toward tenant rights organizations, shared my own experience. Slowly, methodically, those properties became financial sinkholes for her. Vacancies rose. Complaints piled up. Legal threats loomed. Property management firms blacklisted her. Word spread. Karen's side hustle bled money until she had no choice but to sell, at a loss, of course. Her empire, once built on fear and control, now lay in ruins. And through it all, I remained calm, patient, deliberate. Neighbors began referring to me half-jokingly as the HOA Avenger. I didn't mind. I wasn't seeking titles. I was seeking peace. And slowly, surely, that's exactly what I reclaimed. The house felt lighter without Karen's shadow looming over it. Jenna and I expanded our garden, added a fire pit where we'd host gatherings with the very neighbors Karen once tried to pit against us. Laughter replaced whispered complaints. Friendships grew where fear had once taken root. But Karen's story wasn't quite finished. One afternoon, months after the dust had settled, I got a call from an unfamiliar number. A young woman, nervous, apologetic. She explained that she was Karen's niece, estranged, but now tasked with helping her aunt clean up the mess she'd left behind. Karen, it seemed, had moved in with family far away. She was sick, not terminal, but broken in the way people get when their world collapses, and there's no one left to prop them up. The niece asked for one thing. Could she retrieve a few items Karen had left in a community storage shed tied to the HOA's former operations? Files, mostly. Useless now. But Karen clung to them like relics of a lost kingdom. I agreed, with one condition. Karen was never to step foot in this neighborhood again. The niece promised. I believed her. She seemed embarrassed by the connection. As I watched her load those dusty boxes into her car, I felt nothing. No triumph. No lingering anger. Just relief. Closure. A chapter finally ending not with fireworks or revenge plots, but with the quiet thud of a storage door locking for the last time. Karen was gone. The HOA was gone. Peace had returned. And for the first time since moving here, my home felt truly mine. There's a unique kind of satisfaction in watching a tyrant unravel, not through violent confrontation or explosive fallout, but through the slow, deliberate unraveling of everything they once clung to for power. That's exactly how Karen's empire fell, not with one loud, dramatic collapse, but with a methodical peeling away of every illusion she'd wrapped herself in. By the time her niece had carted off those pathetic boxes of HOA paperwork, Karen's presence in our neighborhood wasn't just gone. It had been erased. No more threatening letters stuffed into mailboxes. No more early morning inspections. No more whispered rumors of fines or retaliations. The HOA signs had been pulled up and tossed. The website she'd lorded over had been shut down. Without Karen's iron grip, people started to breathe again. And as for me, I'd done what I'd set out to do. Protect my home, protect my wife, and make sure Karen could never pull this kind of stunt on anyone else. But the beauty of karma is how it works on its own schedule, long after you've stepped away. The stories started trickling in. Apparently, Karen's move upstate hadn't been her choice. After the lawsuits, the fines, and the shattered reputation, she hadn't been able to sell her home easily. Her finances were in ruins. Bankruptcy had been filed. Creditors had come knocking. Family, those distant relatives she'd barely acknowledged in her heyday, had reluctantly taken her in. She'd been forced to abandon her perfect suburban throne for a cramped spare bedroom in a house where no one respected her title of former HOA president. Neighbors in her new town reported similar behavior starting up again. Complaints about lawn heights, cars parked slightly askew, children's bikes left in driveways. But unlike our neighborhood, this place wasn't governed by an HOA. And when Karen tried to bring her clipboard and threats routine to city officials, she was met with rolled eyes and polite refusals. No one cared about her petty vendettas anymore. The final blow came when I received a certified letter, not from Karen, but from a firm handling the dissolution of the HOA's last assets. Apparently, in her desperation, Karen had tried to leverage what little remained of the HOA's finances to pay off her personal debts. Illegal, of course. The forensic accounting revealed a tangled web of misappropriated funds, unauthorized withdrawals, and falsified invoices. Nothing grand enough to warrant jail time. She'd been careful in that regard, but enough to ensure she'd never be trusted with authority again. The irony? The funds had to be redistributed according to HOA bylaws. And as a dues-paying member prior to the HOA's implosion, I was entitled to a portion of the refund. It wasn't a lot, a few $1,000s, but it felt symbolic. I took that check, cashed it, and used it to finish something I'd been planning since the very beginning, building out my home security system to an even higher standard. Cameras, sensors, smart locks, backup power, the works. Not out of fear. Karen was gone, after all, but as a monument to the idea that no one ever again would cross my threshold uninvited. Neighbors took notice. Some asked for advice. Others followed suit, installing their own systems, taking back control of their homes after years of Karen's invasive rule. The neighborhood transformed, not just physically, but in spirit. People planted the flowers they wanted, painted their homes the colors they loved, parked their cars without fear of retribution. Kids played freely. Families hosted block parties without worrying about permits or Karen's passive-aggressive email chains. Peace had returned, not because someone handed it to us, but because we took it back. And yet, despite the satisfaction of seeing Karen dismantled, there was one more twist, one final, poetic turn that sealed her fate and left me with the quiet, enduring satisfaction that true revenge is never loud. It's simply thorough. A few months later, a real estate agent friend of mine called. He handled properties statewide and had come across a listing he thought I'd appreciate, a modest home in Karen's new town. Bank-owned, foreclosed. The previous occupant? Karen. Apparently, she'd tried to start over, but her debts had caught up to her. Medical bills, legal fees, unpaid fines, all of it too much. The bank had taken the home. She was reportedly renting a small apartment now, living off a fixed income, with no influence, no clipboard, and no authority beyond the four walls of her unit. I didn't buy the house. I didn't need it, but I did attend the auction, just to see it for myself. To stand quietly at the back and watch as the last physical symbol of her supposed superiority was sold to the highest bidder. I said nothing, didn't raise a hand, just observed as the gavel fell, and Karen's final grasp on control slipped away. Walking away from that auction, I felt no anger, no triumph, just closure. The kind that settles deep in your bones when you know, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that justice, true justice, has been served. Back home, Jenna and I sat on the porch, watching the sunset bleed across the sky. Our dog sprawled at our feet. The garden, once criticized by Karen for being too wild, bloomed vibrantly around us. You think she'll ever show her face here again? Jenna asked. I smiled. Not a chance. Because some people learn through power, others through fear, and a rare few, like Karen, through complete and total humiliation. She had unlocked my door once, believing herself untouchable. Now, locked doors weren't just a symbol of safety. They were a reminder this was my home, my peace, my victory, and no Karen could ever take that away again. There's a certain peace that settles in once all the noise dies down. Not just the peace of a quiet neighborhood, free from Karen's harassment, but the deeper, more satisfying quiet that comes when you realize you've truly outlasted someone who tried to break you. For months after the last traces of Karen's influence vanished from our street, life began to look like what Jen and I had always wanted when we bought this house. Simple, secure, and finally ours. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact for fear of becoming Karen's next target were now hosting weekend barbecues, waving hello as they walked their dogs, and sharing laughter in driveways rather than whisper complaints over fences. Without Karen's constant scrutiny hanging over everyone, the neighborhood found a new rhythm, one driven by genuine community rather than fear of HOA citations. And as for me, I settled into a routine that didn't involve checking my mailbox for passive-aggressive notices or reviewing my security footage for trespassers. My camera stayed up, of course, but more as a quiet reminder of everything we'd overcome than out of necessity. The fear that had once lurked in the background, the fear that Karen would escalate beyond fines and letters, had evaporated. But it wasn't just about the neighborhood anymore. Karen's downfall had left a ripple effect, one that spread far beyond our little community. You see, the story of HOA Karen had legs. Local papers picked it up. A few regional news outlets ran features on the HOA president who took her authority too far. Before long, Jen and I were fielding polite but persistent inquiries from reporters wanting to turn our ordeal into a cautionary tale. I declined most of them. I wasn't interested in 15 minutes of fame. I just wanted to live in peace. But some stories, it seems, take on a life of their own. Online forums began to share the details. Reddit threads about entitled HOA boards and petty Karens found fresh fuel in Karen's spectacular downfall. YouTube channels dedicated to HOA horror stories picked it up, dramatizing the tale with exaggerated reenactments and clickbait titles. At first, it felt surreal watching strangers debate the details of my life, but over time, I recognized a silver lining. Karen had become a cautionary tale, not just for HOAs or petty suburban dictators, but for anyone who thought power meant immunity. Her name, at least locally, was synonymous with the dangers of unchecked authority, and that, more than any fine or foreclosure, was a punishment she never anticipated. Irony has a long memory. Not long after things settled, I received a letter from a property management conference organizer. They wanted me to speak, a retired cop turned reluctant HOA expert, on the topic of community overreach and the importance of checks and balances in neighborhood governance. I politely declined. I had no interest in making a career out of HOA warfare, but it struck me just how far-reaching Karen's actions had become. Even in her absence, she was still teaching people lessons, just not the ones she intended. As for Karen herself, rumors trickled in from time to time. Word was, she tried to start fresh in a new community. No HOA this time, just a small apartment, some volunteer work, a life stripped of the influence she once wielded like a weapon. But habits die hard. Even there, she couldn't resist sticking her nose where it didn't belong, complaining to landlords about neighbors' blinds being uneven, nitpicking about hallway decorations. Only this time, no one cared. Without a title, without bylaws to hide behind, Karen was just another bitter voice in the crowd. Last I heard, she'd been asked to vacate. Too many complaints from tenants. Too many arguments with property managers. The woman who once ruled with an iron clipboard couldn't even keep a lease in her name. Jenna. And I never spoke of her again after that. There was no need. We'd won, not in courtrooms or newspaper headlines, but in the quiet, steady reclaiming of our lives. Every sunset on our porch, every laugh shared with neighbors, every carefree afternoon spent tending to the wild garden Karen once hated. Those were our victories. And perhaps the greatest irony of all, the very home Karen broke into, the home she thought she could police, became a symbol of freedom, not just for us, but for the entire street. What she tried to control, we reclaimed. What she tried to diminish, we rebuilt. And where she tried to enforce silence and fear, we found laughter and community. Years later, when new neighbors moved in and asked about the history of the HOA, we'd smile and share the sanitized version. There used to be one. It didn't work out. No need to mention Karen by name. Her legacy was already buried beneath new friendships and fresh paint. But sometimes late at night, as I lock the doors, more out of habit than necessity, I think back to the moment she stepped into my living room uninvited and found herself face to face with the police. The look on her face, the dawning realization that her authority ended at my doorstep. That image will stay with me forever, not as a source of anger, not even as a trophy, but as a quiet reminder. This is my home, my peace, my victory, and no Karen, clipboard or not, will ever take that away again.